Hey guys, welcome to Ask Truth Apologetics. I'm constantly bombarded with questions about the authorship of the gospel, how we can trust or rely or know that the gospels were written near the time of Jesus. How can they be accurate? And for some reason, a lot of people want to know how can we confirm or know who authored the gospels. Thankfully, I was watching Bob the Builder's channel on SoCo Films. So if you guys haven't subscribed to him or SoCo Films, now would be a fantastic time to do so. And he was having a great conversation with Mike Lacona, who is an expert in kind of the New Testament, how the authorship came about and whatnot. So I think this would be a really cool thing for us to take a look at and discuss a little bit about. So I'm not going to talk too much in this video. So all we're going to have to do is watch and listen.
That we don't know who wrote the Gospels, and therefore we can't trust them. How would you reply to that?
Well, I do think we have a good idea of who wrote the Gospels, and I think that this hand is overplayed by those who, like Bart Ehrman, will say we have no idea because they say they're anonymous. What people like Ehrman and others do not take into consideration is that virtually every biography in antiquity around that time was anonymous. There are approximately close to 100 biographies. If we take the period within 150 years before Jesus to 150 years after, there are nearly 100 biographies that were written during that time, not of Jesus, but of all these different figures. And Plutarch wrote 48 of them that have survived. He wrote more than 60, but 48 of them have survived. Then you got Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars. So there's 60 right there of the nearly 100. Of these, there are only 2 of them. Actually, there may be only 1 of them within that period that is that has the name, and that would be the passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata around the end of the middle of the 2nd century. There's only one other biography of which I know, but you have to go even further, much further, and it's not anonymous. And that would be the life of Aelius in the Historia Augusta, written at the end of the 4th century. So, I mean, we're talking about after Constantine now. At the very late 4th century, it's written. So, other than that, they're all anonymous in the sense that they don't contain names in the title, the name of the author in the title, or in the proem. And in fact, you've got Livy, Sallust, 2 of the greatest Roman historians, and all of their literature is anonymous. Their name doesn't appear anywhere in it. Same thing with Plutarch, who is considered to be the greatest ancient biographer of any who wrote in Greek or Latin. And all of his biographies that have survived are anonymous. And his name doesn't appear anywhere in there. Well, you say, well, then how did we know? Well, we don't know who wrote. We don't know how the ancients knew that Plutarch wrote these, or that Sallust or that Livy wrote these things. But somehow the ancients knew. It could be that their names were, on like a bookmark, what would be the equivalent of a bookmark, or that they were on the outside of a scroll, or, if you had like the book, the codex like we have, maybe it was on a cover, but not on the initial parchment or a papyri inside. We don't know, but they seem to know. I would also add that the external evidence we have for the authorship, the traditional authorship of all 4 Gospels, is superior to what we have for, let's say, Plutarch, the greatest, who, again, regarded as the greatest of all ancient biographers. It's much better than what we have for Plutarch. It's better than we have for Sallust. I mean, the first person to mention Sallust's history is Seneca. I believe it was Seneca the Elder. And he's writing about 75 years, maybe it was Seneca the Younger, and he's writing 75 years after Sallust wrote the histories. And then the first to mention Sallust's war with Catiline and war with Jugurtha, Quintilian, writing at the end of the 1st century, or about at least 135 years after Sallust wrote. For the Gospels, you've got Papias, who's writing, scholars differ, but anywhere from the year 100 to 150. Most scholars go with 130 today. I think it's 110 or before, but let's just go with the 130. That's within about 35 years after the Gospel of John. And Sallust, I'm sorry, it's not Sallust, Papias says, he mentions the authorship of Matthew and Mark, and he says he got this information from an associate of one of Jesus' apostles while that apostle was still teaching, which means that Papias received this information. Although he may be writing around the year 130, he received this information toward the end of the 1st century from someone who traveled with one of Jesus' disciples, and he got it while that disciple was still preaching. That's pretty amazing. That's our first. And then you've got others who mentioned P75, a manuscript, early manuscript that mentions Luke being written by Luke. You've got Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century who mentions Matthew and Mark being written, and he quotes from these Gospels verbatim. You've got Irenaeus, somewhere between the years 174 and 189, and he's the first to mention the authorship of all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you've got this in less than 100 years after. Now for Plutarch, just real quickly, Plutarch, the very first source we have for him is the Lamprias Catalog, which was written somewhere between 100 and 200 years or even longer after Plutarch wrote, and it's falsely attributed to Plutarch's son. So yet that is our best source, our earliest source that mentions the literature that Plutarch was supposed to have written. And yet there aren't any classicists out there today who would question whether Plutarch wrote the Lives. So the evidence we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, although it's not by any means perfect, it is not unimpeachable. It is stronger still than what we have for much of ancient literature. And the fact that the Gospels are anonymous, I think, is a nothing burger. There's just nothing to that.
Yeah, I
All right. So as you guys can see there, and I'm just going to run through this really quickly and leave it at that. Some of the key points that we can take away from this is that over about a 300-year period of time, about 150 BC, before Christ, and about 150 AD, there were written about 100 different biographies. And what Mike was saying is that only one between that specific time period actually has an author listed within the text of that particular biography. So what he does is he starts to compare our ability to know whether or not Plutarch, like he says, was written by Plutarch. None of Plutarch's stuff, which make up about 48 of the 100 biographies, was attributed or is attributed to Plutarch. Experts don't question whether or not it was from Plutarch. They all agree that it was from Plutarch. And if you compare how long it took for someone to start attributing those biographies to him or make mention of it in some existent writings that we can view today, is it was somewhere between 100 and 200 years after Plutarch was written. And again, that's the strongest historical case for who wrote those particular biographies. And like Mike says, nobody questions that. Nobody says that wasn't he didn't write it. Everybody just agrees with that. So we're comparing apples to apples here. Okay, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were all written within the first century of Christianity, and they are very, very, very well attested. I'm taking a look at my notes here. So they're more well attested to it. So Papias is someone who lived about 60 AD to 130 AD, and he wrote that John's gospel was written by John. And even if you're going based on the most conservative scholarship, that would have been about 130 or so AD. And he says by name that John wrote the book of John. He also makes mention of Matthew and Mark. So we're going to look at some of these ancient manuscripts like P66, which is our earliest known gospel, which is what we have that today in our hands, a complete gospel of John that was completed somewhere between 100 and 200 AD. These people were alive at the time, right? The John was alive at the time of Papias. Papias was alive at the time of John, and these people are making mention of who these authors are, and we still have their writing in existence to this day. So what Mike says is, he says, look, you can't say for sure, right, without a shadow of a doubt, who the authors were. And as Christians, we need to be honest, and we have to say the same thing. We can't know for sure, but if we're comparing apples to apples, the authorship of the Gospels is the most well-attested authorship of any ancient biography that we know of today. The authorship of it is just incredibly well attested. One other thing that I'd like to say before we close is you guys have to take into consideration who, if someone's just making up the name of who the author of these Gospels are, what names are they going to choose, right? So if I'm just trying to make Christianity the world's best, largest, most trusted religion, and I don't have an author attributed to, let's say, the Gospel of Mark, who am I going to attribute this to, right? When you read through the Gospels, you're going to want to attribute it to some of the biggest names, right? Some of the most famous disciples, or you could even say it was from Jesus, but they don't say that. It says Mark. Okay, Mark is a nobody. He's the scribe of Peter, and he's mentioned in passing essentially in the book of Acts. Okay, so if I'm going to just go back and make up who authored this book, I'm going to say, look, Peter authors this book. This is the Gospel of Peter, or the sons of Zebedee, like James was the author of this gospel, or Doubting Thomas was the author of this gospel. But instead, it's Mark. Who's Mark? So there's no motive for anyone to be lying about the authorship of this, and the tradition goes back all the way to the times of the disciples, the times of when the authors were writing it, so everybody knows who it was on the traditional basis. Same thing for Matthew. Who's Matthew, right? Well, Matthew's a tax collector, but not one of the more famous disciples. Why would they choose Matthew? If they didn't know who it was, again, like I said, why wouldn't they attribute it to James or Peter or Philip or Thomas or any of the other more famous disciples? And the same thing for Luke. Luke obviously was not a disciple, but he was someone who wrote about it. He was a historian and a physician who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And John is really the only famous gospel writer, and he has actually the best attestation to who the author was. So that's pretty much all I have to say, guys. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the box here. I'm gonna leave a link to the entire interview. You guys can check that out on Bob the Builder's channel with him and Mike Licona. But until then, you guys need to know something. Jesus loves you.